It was a raving and troubled time. This period brought pain and suffering, political and religious conflicts, and turnarounds, but at the same time, it provided a certain spiritual reassurance to the nation in the form of a unique book. Up to this day, this book is considered by many Czechs, Moravians and Silesians to be a national treasure. The best-known Czech translation of the Bible, the Kralice Bible, has far exceeded the time of its origin by its significance. If you want to know more about this book and the age of its origin, join me and my guests as we travel through time. Here's some of the memories of a man who was an eyewitness of events at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. My name is Matthew Prokop. I was just a small child when our family moved from Boleslav to Ivančice. You won't find my name in any book. I didn't achieve anything remarkable worthy of recording in the chronicles. However, in my long life, I have met many great men that I would like to tell you about. I will recount the dark age of the past, but also the light of the Word that helped me and thousands of others through that time. First, let us go back 100 years after the horrible and bloody wars of the Hussites. A man named Petr Chelčický rejected the path of violence, and his teachings became the foundation for a community of Christians called the Unity of the Brethren.
Put your sword back to its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. The land was devastated and impoverished. After listening to the reformer Jan Hus, people's expectations of God's kingdom on earth were not fulfilled. Hussite wars plundered the land. This frustration became the driving power for the following events. A group of eager young men decided to leave. It began with a desire to live the kingdom of God they had been longing for. So they separated themselves from society and formed a small community, read the Word of God together and prayed. That is the beginning of the unity of brethren, though at that time they called themselves the Brethren of the Law of Christ. In 1464 they formed this community in the mountains around Rychnov. This is the origin or the root of the formation of the unity of brethren, people who decided to live out what they read in the Bible. They completely refused the outer society. They were regarded as a cult, and I think deservedly, because they detached themselves from society, disengaged from community, and didn't accept anyone into their ranks. In their aversion towards outer society, they also rejected any invitations to participate in state administration and refused to engage in some trades. For example, those producing luxuries. They lived a simple, strict life, trying to fulfill the ideal they saw described in the New Testament. It didn't go unnoticed in society, and their reputation began to spread. And people started to come to their group. Those who wanted to be a part of this ideal, more and more people.
Eventually, the brethren recognized their mistake of isolation and began to open themselves to society again. Moreover, the unity put a strong emphasis on education, which was uncommon for that time.
In all possible places, wherever the Unity could find a patron who would facilitate the group, in a city or a little town, immediately it started a Brethren school alongside the local church. The Brethren school was a wonderful phenomenon for the society because they were looking for a way to make education more attractive to the children as opposed to practices in regular schools of the day. Obviously, it was as pleasing for the commoners as for the nobles. So both the commoners and the nobles began to put their children in the Brethren schools. Naturally, this led to the financial support of the cause, which was of utter importance to the movement. The Unity of Brethren discovered very quickly the groundbreaking significance of the printing press. The movable type printing appeared in Czech just a few years after Gutenberg invented it around 1440 to 1450. The Unity of Brethren learned to use it effectively and efficiently. Brethren understood that printing could be a very efficient tool in spreading their teachings, ideas, and everything they wanted to impart to society.
When, as a young lad, I first entered the world of knowledge and I was able to read my first book, I stood in silent awe. My dear mother, who didn't know how to read, listened to my reading with gratitude. At that time, I finally realized why the authorities disliked when the commoners were reading books. And that is why the Brethren printing shop was a thorn in the side of religious authorities. We have to remember that the Unity of Brethren was persecuted since the very beginning of its formation. It was mainly persecuted from Catholics, who easily obtained the king's permission to suppress religious movements of any kind. But it was also persecuted by the Utraquists, who represented the moderate faction of the Czech Reformation. It was the Utraquists who defeated the more radical Taborites in the famous Battle of Lipany.
Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or anguish, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness?
I can't forget about Bishop Blahoslav. I liked him a lot. He endeared all the children to him because of his cheerfulness and humor. I have remembered his wise advice for a long time.
If you don't use the gifts and skills in science, education, or in arts, you are burying your talents and failing the commission given to you by God.
He also conceived a new school book that he has called a syllabary or spelling book. Sometimes he used to wear this unusual object on his nose that he used to call glasses. He said it helped him to see better. I remember we were both marveling and laughing about it. No one finds it amusing today, and I am thankful to the Lord for my good sight, since I never needed to use those glasses.
He was a reformer to the bone, so it was typical for him to start a reform. The first area he expanded was the school system itself. There was a Brethren school and a prospering Brethren church. He thought it was a great foundation to start a school for future Brethren preachers. He also searched for ways to start a Brethren grammar school that would provide further education to the children finishing basic school. After a meeting and an agreement with the Wittenberg University, he enlarged the school system by founding an academy. It was a Brethren grammar school. It meant another step forward in the education system. One very successful experiment was taking the children from schools to workmen's shops to see the small tradesmen and businessmen in action. The children began to learn the trades much faster because they were exposed through experience. At the same time, the children were able to develop and grow in their artistic talents and skills. The unity started to open towards the area of music, singing, and art in general. Based on a different concept of brotherhood, meaning the brothers and sisters were not living separately but together, the schools allowed both girls and boys to study and learn. I think it was rooted in the basic understanding of being equal before God and disregarding social status. Those schools had students, both girls and boys, whose parents were townsmen, nobles, or just common people.
My childhood was a beautiful time of games and discoveries, but in my free time I enjoyed reading the most. I don't know to this day how I earned Bishop Blahoslav's favour, but he allowed me to read the precious books from the Brethren Library.
Most importantly, Matthew, don't forget that scholarship and artistry are not for our own enrichment, but merely to serve others. In the early 60s of the 16th century, the situation in Bohemia for the Unity and for Brethren printing shops was very complicated. In Moravia, there was still an atmosphere of tolerance and a coexistence of different social groups, confessions and people in general. However, in Bohemia, that was not the case. Therefore, Jan Blahoslav moved the printing shop from Bohemia to Ivančice, a town in southern Moravia. It was one of the most important centers of the Unity of Brethren and had a Brethren school. At that time, the Unity was in a transition of its orientation from the Silesian and Saxon Lutheranism towards the Calvinism of Western Europe. It was also a result of Jan Blahoslav's influence. In the cities such as Basel, where he had studied, or Geneva, the followers of John Calvin were putting a great emphasis on the Word, the spoken Word, the written Word, on the Word of God and on the study of the Bible.
The printing shop in the Brethren House has always been fascinating to me. I was starting to understand what a valuable treasure existed on one thin piece of printed paper.
When the Brethren approached Jan Blahoslav with a request to translate the New Testament into Czech, he truly hesitated. One of the reasons was his busyness. He was already the master archivist of the Unity. Later he was designated scrivener, which was something between a chronicler and a secretary of the Unity, as we would call it today. Eventually, he was elected bishop and became a member of the top management of the Unity of Brethren. But the reason for his hesitation was much deeper. Jan Blahoslav was fully aware of the importance of such a task and of its difficult complexity.
I remember when strange things started to happen to Jan Blahoslav. He was unusually pale and sickly. Frightening nightmares and odd visions about war and bloodshedding were oppressing his mind for weeks. More often than before, I was seeing him worried and in serious conversations with Brother Solin, the head printer.
I am convinced that God Himself has sent me these strange visions. Our nation will need comfort and encouragement in the dark times that are soon to come.
That was when he started to work on a book so dear to my heart, on the translation of the New Testament.
He began the work of translation true to his character. He aimed for a high goal and pursued it with vigor and steadfastness. With his translation, he wanted to create a literary language with a highly cultivated, rich style that would become a standard for Czech language. Its quality would align with classic languages, such as Latin or Greek. First, he studied all the Czech translations generated in the 150 years before. There were a number of those, but all were translations from the Latin Vulgate. He studied these translations, compared them with the Greek original, and found more than 600 mistakes and declinations. Jan Blahoslav also plunged into all the famous translations in foreign languages, focusing especially on the translation methodology. It was a remarkable achievement. Not only was it an upstanding translation of the New Testament of high quality, but its language was also very lively and modern. Thanks to the printing shop and the way the Unity of Brethren operated, it quickly became accessible to ordinary people.
Jan Blahoslav died unexpectedly. He was 48 years old. I was supposed to help out in the printing shop, but I didn't feel like working. I escaped out to the fields with the New Testament translation in my hand to mourn the death of a man who had been like a father to me. There I experienced the power of the living word. Surrounded by God's creation, I soaked in the encouragement and comfort captured in the gracious translation of the Book of God.
Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth on me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die." The year of 1578 marks an important event in the famous Brethren Academy in Ivančice. Two paths crossed of people who were to become very politically influential. 14-year-old Karel the Older of Zierotin and Karl I of Liechtenstein, 9 years old. These boys had similar backgrounds. Karel the Older of Zierotin represented the third generation of the Zierotins, who were the protectors of the Unity of Brethren. Karl I of Liechtenstein was highly descended from a noble family, owning large estates in southern Moravia and Lower Austria. Both Karels were given a very good and prestigious education at the academy, while at the same time it was emphasized that all the teachings and instruction would be of practical use for life.
The Ivančice school was prestigious because it became an academy, which offered superiority for renowned teachers. Esrom Rudinger from the Wittenberg University became its chancellor. He was also a brilliant schoolmaster. The benefit of the school was definitely its professional quality, but also its students had to pay tuition. Those were usually sons of noble families. That is why people used to call it a nobility school.
In 1577, an imperial decree was issued on the incentive of the Bishop of Olomouc, who, as an exponent of the Catholic side, was strongly opposed to the Unity of Brethren and all their activities. The document was directed against the so-called religious novelties in Moravia. Practically, it gave the Catholic side an opportunity to intervene against the unity and its activities in Ivančice.
When the Bishop of Olomouc found out about the secret printing shop, he commanded an inspection in Ivančice. The brothers didn't waste any time, and under cover of the night, they moved all the printing shop to the Kralice fortress, where it found a safe hiding place under the protection of the Zierotins.
Jan the Older of Zierotin, the father of Karol the Older, had been preparing this Operation Kralice for some time already. He purchased and reconstructed the Kralice fortress and populated the surrounding villages. He was excellent in the area of economy and agriculture. He truly put together a project that we would call a self-sufficient farmstead that was supposed to finance the whole Bible translation as well as the operation of the printing shop, including all its employees. Transferring the printing shop to Kralice encouraged the identity of the local community as the whole village was connected to the printing shop. It attracted erudite theologians and linguistic experts, and there was also the local Brethren Church. Therefore, at that time, Kralice became a unique biblical center, one of the most modern operating centers in Europe.
My heart was overflowing with joy when, by the grace of God, I could watch the genesis of another great translation, this time the one of the Old Testament. For numerous years, many of the best servants of God put their effort into the complete Czech translation of the Bible, which was the fulfillment of the dream of my dear brother Jan Blahoslav.
Jana Blahoslava.
The Kralice Bible was a collective work of a number of translators, printers, and assistants. It was not one man's achievement. The whole process was very long and took several decades. The Czech text was based on original languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, which was unique in our environment. It is the first time the Czech people put their hands on a Czech Bible translated from original languages. It was really unique. The Kralice Bible is widely used even today, which demonstrates the fact that the Brethren did an excellent job during those years.
Bible kralická je hojně používaná dodnes.
During the infant years of his younger brother Jan Diviš, and then after his early death, Karel the Elder was the steward of the Zierotin domain around Rosice and Náměšť, and became practically one of the most powerful men and also the most educated man in Moravia.
Karel of Zierotin, who after 1600 started to call himself Karol the Older of Zierotin, follows the steps of Jan Blahoslav in his strong focus on education. He was studying in Italy and mainly in Western Europe as Calvinist universities in Geneva, Basel and Strasbourg. He visited the countries in the eastern part of Europe, but also the Netherlands, France and England. After 10 years, when he eventually returned home from his studies, he became one of the most renowned experts in the area of the law and theology. He was one of the best scholars in the whole profane world of Central Europe. More importantly, during his travels, he made connections with famous scholars that he sent his relatives and friends to for further studies. In the context of the unity of brethren, he became an advocate of education and cultivation of the unity's young members, who are not only of noble origin. It was his warm religious devotion quite abnormal for that time, that made Zierotin an exceptional personality. He was convinced that personal interests and even religious interests had to be submitted to public interest of the nation. He was a Moravian patriot, as is evident in his whole life, and he had a great respect for the law. Municipal law and the constitution meant everything to him.
It is interesting to note that Karol the Older of Zierotin spoke many languages. Besides Czech and perfect Latin, he spoke excellent French, very good Italian and quite good German. It opened all kinds of resources of information to him and gave him a great position in society. A man of his kind had great insight into political situations and played an important role in Czech countries, or more precisely, in Moravia, which was still an independent Margravat at that time.
Along with his social prestige, position in the society and his power, Karol the Older basically reached the highest status within Moravia as he became the Moravian provincial governor. This position was the second most powerful figure in Moravia after the emperor. Despite this position, he didn't hesitate to submit himself to the authorities of his church, the Unity of Brethren, which reflected his personal humility. Zierotin was a man of pure heart. He was accomplishing what he believed in, and he believed in what he accomplished. He was married 4 times, and he loved his wives with all his heart. At the age of 50, he married his 4th wife, his neighbour, Catherine of Waldstein, who was the same age. This relationship lasted and was very gentle and affectionate till the end of their lives. As students of paleography, we studied one of Zierotin's letters that was dated 1622. At that time, Zierotin wasn't a young man anymore, and still he addressed his wife like this: "My beloved heart, be of good health and be well in all things. This is my faithful and sincere wish for you, in the same way I wish that for myself." I think this warm note well expresses Zierotin's inner spiritual life.
The church in Kralice is definitely one of the places worth mentioning. Sunday services were visited by people from the village, printers, and also by theologians residing in the biblical centre in the Kralice fortress. The nobility from Náměšť also participated in the Brethren services.
In its early years, the Unity of Brethren was essentially a very closed community, excluding the nobles. Here we can see a turning point in their history when the Brethren were consistently applying the principle of equality before God to Brethren nobility. The local church in Kralice was a beautiful example. In general, Brethren churches were very simply ornamented. The church in Kralice is an exception. Inside there are 10 inscriptions, some of them of very good quality. One inscription is connected to the common approach of nobility to common people. It says, "Love the light of wisdom, you who govern the people." This addressed the nobles as stewards and leaders of the nation. There were a number of patrons, nobles at that time. In this regard, again, Zierotin was outstanding. By the volume of his patronage, the number of people he sponsored, and the varied social levels of his sponsored individuals. Some of them were sons of aristocratic families, usually related by blood to the Zierotin family. Some of them were people from his manor, cooks, masons, and others. He used to have them accompany him on his travels abroad to show them the world and give them opportunities to learn and grow. Of course, Zierotin was well educated and perceptive enough to discern people who were gifted and talented. He highly respected them. That is why he must have been impressed by young Jan Amos Comenius, whom he probably met in the beginning of the 17th century.
Well, look at him. He returned from his studies by foot, since the money I gave him for travel, he used to buy books. During the time young Jan Amos was staying at the Zierotins, he kept astonishing people with the depth of his knowledge that seemed so ahead of its time. He was very interested personally in the new publication of the complete Kralice Bible. It was Jan Amos who later wrote about Karel the Elder that he was a man who experienced the ferocity and the greed of this world, yet still kept peace in a haven of rest in his conscience. Due to frequent accusations from the side of the Czech estates against Karel the Elder, Comenius stood up to defend the name of this man who had always acted with the best intentions and a clear conscience.
It is probably unfair to blame Karel the Older of Zierotin of failure in regards to the Czech estates uprising. His stance was legitimate, justified, and far from treason. But evidently, many of his fellow believers bore a grudge against him. Like the majority of noblemen, Karel naturally had military experience from his youth. His attitude towards conflict may have taken root in those years. He consistently held the view of Peter Chelčický that conflicts must always be approached and resolved peacefully. As we know, Karel was convinced that God wouldn't bless a violent solution.
You seem worried and troubled lately.
There is nothing I dread more than a new outbreak of war. I am deeply convinced that God is not on the side of the Czech estates.
We know that Zierotin approved of the idea itself of Czech estates, but not the means of its execution. It is really questionable if we can judge Zierotin's stand as a failure. After all, we know that the estates uprising started the very cruel 30 Years' War that plundered all Europe. Maybe Zierotin's role here was one of a prophet.
It is exceedingly odd that people are so very disappointed with me, though I have done nothing so far but recommend peace. I have cared for peace earnestly and invested all my strength. I have not offended anyone with words or acts, and concerning the Czechs, I have never proclaimed, professed or proved that they are not right in the matter itself. It was the implementation that I have never applauded, but it was never a pretext to become their enemy.
When talking about Karel the Older's personal qualities, it is often emphasized that he didn't like radical solutions. He didn't like military solutions and seemed to shuffle among various political and, in the times of war, military parties. It wasn't so much based on his personal character as on his personal experience. Young Zierotin took part in two interesting military campaigns. One was to help the Huguenot King of France, Henry of Navarre. The second was to protect Central Europe against the Turks in the territory of today's Hungary. When he returned from these campaigns and started his official political career, he came to the conclusion that there is only one solution to prevent and solve problems: justice and morality.
Many times I have remembered the horrifying visions of Brother Blahoslav that have been unfolding in front of our very eyes. Dark times have come. First, it was the Battle of the White Mountain, and then a horrible war for 30 long years that didn't spare Zierotin's domains.
We have to realize that the 30 Years' War decreased the population in the Czech countries by 1/3. After the war, it took several generations to fill the gap. It affected not only the demography of the nation, but also the whole cultural development of the Czech territory.
Bohemia and Moravia suffered the most under the marchers or armies who were constantly moving through. Imperial, Swedish, Danish, armies of allies. They always needed food which belonged to others. When someone refused to give them what they had, the soldiers would kill them and burn their house. Unfortunately, the town of Kralice wasn't spared of those ravages either.
Karel the Elder of Zierotin had hastily moved the printing shop to Náměšť, and the next day, Kralice was plundered by soldiers.
I would like to illustrate Zierotin's hastiness by the discovery of a large quantity of depot, as the archaeologist would say, of jots, the metallic parts used for printing, which were used to put together the texts of the Kralice Bible. These jots were found in the moat. Probably one of the defenders of the fortress, or even one of the attackers, dumped these out of the window into the moat. It is a unique discovery in the context of the whole of Central Europe. It is interesting that when our colleagues from the Moravian Municipal Museum were trying to reconstruct the functioning of the Unity and the printing of the Kralice Bible, they took some of those jots, put them on the sheets of the Kralice Bible, and were able to identify specific letters they were used for. It is interesting to see that this course of events has its cultural significance. After the defeat of the Estates Uprising, Karel the Older faced a very hectic time. He needed to attend to the matters of his own family by trying to prevent the confiscation of family possessions, as well as those of his relatives and friends. He also made efforts to help the exiles from the ranks of common people, ordinary non-Catholics. Because of the 30 Years' War, many people ran away and many were killed. Many quarters, villages and towns were burnt down or plundered, and the whole country was devastated. Under the surface of the Czech nation, many people stayed illegally devoted to the faith of their fathers, and in secret they kept reading the Kralice Bible.
An unusual time came around in the Czech countries after the Battle of White Mountain. It lasted basically for 150 years, a time covering 5 generations. It is hard to imagine that from one generation to generation, they had to pass on some kind of testimony, some spiritual legacy. It must have been difficult, as many times they had no future hope. Once it was discovered that they kept their books, gathered for services, and met in fellowship to sing or to pray, those people were persecuted, imprisoned, or even killed.
I know there are forbidden books in here. Look at that.
That is why many people abandoned all their belongings, and often it was very tragic, as they were in great danger. They were fleeing over the border and they were settling there.
There were thousands of runaways, and in the midst of that, the Kralice Bible served well. The Word of God gave people strength, comfort, and hope. It became everyday bread to the hungry and oppressed souls. At that time, the Kralice Bible became a priceless life companion to many Czechs who left the country or were forced to leave. It became a jewel. Besides personal spiritual gain, its enormous value consisted in the language Jan Blahoslav used in his translation. The Kralice translation can be compared to other brilliant European translations. Let me not forget Karl I of Liechtenstein, who I clearly remembered from the times he used to reside with Karel the Elder in the Ivančice Brethren Academy. His future, though, as we were learning later on, was to become darker and darker.
When young Karl of Liechtenstein was starting his career, no one would think that in a couple of years he would be ennobled as Duke and would become one of the most significant aristocratic figures in the country. In the end of the 16th century, something happened that Karl the Older of Zierotin later bluntly commented on. Karl of Liechtenstein flip-flopped. In today's words, he changed his political affiliation. After his conversion, Karl of Liechtenstein was appointed Moravian provincial governor for a short time. It was the first sign of the fact that his conversion wasn't just a matter of his spirituality, but that the young nobleman was destined for a future political career.
After the Battle of White Mountain, Liechtenstein was referred to as Czech Viceroy because the Emperor appointed him Czech governor.
As the Czech governor, he personified the punishment of the estate's uprising, whether it was his intention or not. The truth is that, unlike other noblemen, he couldn't refuse to preside over the trial condemning the Czech rebels, and eventually also presided in the court during the execution on the Old Town Square in Prague. Liechtenstein becomes the one who would be in the following years, and even after his death in 1627, representing the defeat of the estate's uprising and the punishment of its participants.
Karl I of Liechtenstein, similarly to former Emperor Ferdinand I, considered evangelical books to be very dangerous. It was forbidden to print anything without the permission of the Emperor's office. The Kralice Bible became the most dangerous and most wanted book.
When a Kralice Bible was found, it was immediately burned. It was widely feared because it was faithfully translated from original languages, and it reflected the theological disposition of the unity. It wasn't acceptable.
Karel the Elder of Zierotin personally helped many victims of persecution. He granted asylum to brethren priests, he interceded and helped financially. Jan Amos Comenius was one of those who found asylum in his domain around Brandýs. By the way, it was there he wrote his famous Labyrinth of the World and Paradise of the Heart, which he dedicated to his patron and protector.
A very rigorous edict was released in 1628, which prohibited non-Catholics to reside on Czech territory. Despite the fact that Karel the Older was allowed by the emperor, as one of a few non-Catholics, to stay in his domain, in 1629 he decided to voluntarily leave the country for exile, along with other brothers.
Karel the Elder died in 1636, not long after his return to Moravia from Polish exile. His family couldn't afford a proper princely grave, and that is why, before long, hardly anyone remembered the site of his remains.
After a rainstorm in the 18th century, to great surprise, the Zierotin tomb was found. The Zierotin descendants in Brandýs were unsure what to do with the site and the remains. It took 100 years to arrange to relocate Zierotin's remains to estates of their relatives in northern Moravia in Bludov. Paradoxically, the Catholic chaplain then had arranged to sing a hymn of Zierotin's remains, where Zierotin was saying goodbye to Bohemia when transported for the last time to the neighboring Moravian part of the country. In my opinion, Karel the Older of Zierotin should be remembered as a supporter of the Protestant cause, as a sponsor of many significant brethren figures of the time, especially of Jan Amos Comenius. But he should also be remembered as a patron, protector, and sponsor of the Brethren printing shop.
In the beginning of the 18th century, during the reign of Charles VI the Habsburg, an official law stated that all heresy must be exterminated, literally exterminated, which means an absolute annihilation. We can't even imagine what kind of liquidation laws existed at that time. Under those circumstances, people were fleeing and trying to find refuge anywhere abroad where they were accepted. The main flow led to Saxony, especially in the beginning, but later on it stopped, except maybe towards Herrnhut, and the flow redirected primarily to Silesia and up to Berlin.
The Kralica Bible is one of the greatest achievements that we can associate with the unity of brethren or with the culture of the second half of the 16th century in general. I think it follows in the Renaissance work of Jan Blahoslav in a way this bishop of the unity of brethren would have envisioned.
Before reading the last words of Matthew Prokop's story, let me say a few words in conclusion. I think we see in church history that from time to time, many churches inclined towards faction and were concerned about possessions more than it was appropriate. At the same time, the history was repeatedly infused with a new spiritual breeze in the form of various Christian groups that were not necessarily rooted in some institution or didn't fit any particular category. Frequently, they provided the needed stimulus to encourage the corrupted church to return back to the pure ideals. At the time of its origin, the unity of brethren was one of those movements. It caused a lot of misunderstandings and persecutions throughout its existence. The value of the Kralica Bible is in the very fact that it came into existence under such dramatic circumstances. It wasn't a translation born somewhere in a library in the premises of a university just to give someone a job. It arose from an inner existential need. And among other things, it became a necessary and vital component of the fight against corrupted society. Due to the unparalleled translation that many of our ancestors protected by losing their lives, the Kralice Bible is a source of spiritual blessing up to this day. I would never have imagined that one day, as an aged whitebeard, I will also leave my beloved country. Because of my faith, I accepted from my forefathers and cherished it was impossible to stay in the chained country. With the family of my youngest son, we joined a group of exiles and headed to Poland. I was certain to see my native land for the last time, but I only had one desire in my heart, for the next generation of Czechs to be able to come back to their country and have freedom in their own land, to live faithfully according to the Kralice word. I endow to you, Czech nation, as heritage the Book of God, Holy Bible, that my sons with great diligence converted from original languages into Czech. And the Lord blessed it so abundantly that there are few nations that could in their own language hear speaking the prophets and the apostles so truthfully, properly and clearly. Accept it as your own treasure, my beloved country, and use it for the glory of God and for your good and beneficial education.